Alrighty, I will start sharing my screen right now. Let me put that into presenting mode. Can you guys see that? All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Blake. I am a first year currently living in Elliott House. I'm from Chicago. As of right now, I'm thinking of doing a joint concentration in classics and linguistics. So what better way to combine the two things right now than giving you a bit of a linguistic introduction to ancient Greek tonight. I said hello, everybody, earlier, but if you want to say that in ancient Greek, of course, as you all know, we would say "hairete pantes." The same pantes, the pan in that word, you see in words like Pangea or like pantheism or something like that, meaning all, so everybody here. Lots of fun etymologies we get from ancient Greek like that. So I have a bit of a topic outline here for what we will be talking about. We'll start off with what exactly we mean when we say ancient Greek. We will then move over to a brief discussion of how ancient Greek was written. Then we'll talk a bunch about how ancient Greek sounded. And the big topics today will be how ancient Greek nouns worked and how ancient Greek verbs worked, because those are sort of the building blocks off of which everything else in the language is formed. So let's kick it off right here. You can also see this nifty little picture of the Greek alphabet, which I'm sure you've seen several places, before, but that's that right there as well, to refresh your memory a little bit. So what exactly do we mean by ancient Greek? Well, Greek as a whole, like including up to modern Greek, is the longest attested of the Indo-European languages, as we say, the major languages basically of India and Europe. It has been attested for over 3,500 years. So this is a really long time span to talk about. So in order to make it a little easier to talk about, scholars tend to break up the time frame of the language into different periods. And we call the variation of the language as it varies throughout these periods as diachronic variation. Now, we call modern Greek the form of Greek that's been spoken for about the past 500 years. We call the Greek that was spoken for the duration of the Byzantine Empire, Byzantine Greek. We call Koine Greek the Greek that formed the lingua franca of the Mediterranean region from about 300 BCE to 300 CE. We call Classical Greek the forms of Greek that were spoken in classical Greece for about 200 years. And the Classical Greek period is actually when writing started to take on in full swing in Greece. So writing was really only introduced to Greece in the Greek alphabet by Phoenician merchants about 200 years before that in the 8th century BCE. And the largest extant literary work we have from the pre-classical Greek period is Homer's Iliad and Homer's Odyssey. You can see this nifty little sculpture or bust of Homer's head right there on the right. And the Greek of the Iliad and the Odyssey is so unique because it's a blending of several dialects, as we'll talk about, and it's a very poetic form of the language, that the Greek of the Iliad and the Odyssey actually gets its own name. We call that Homeric Greek. And for the longest time, we thought Homeric Greek was basically the earliest Greek we had. But in the 1950s, we deciphered some funny looking tablets in Pylos and on the island of Crete. And we discovered an even earlier period of Greek written in a syllabary, one symbol for one syllable, that was developed in Greece but died out before the Greek alphabet was even developed. And we call that Mycenaean Greek because it was the language of the Mycenaean Greek civilization. So yeah, when we say ancient Greek, we generally refer to Koine Greek, Classical Greek, and Homeric Greek. Mycenaean Greek we didn't discover until after the name ancient Greek began to stick. So it's generally not grouped in with those. But if you take like a ancient Greek class, for example, like if you'd started taking ancient Greek 1 here at Harvard, you would be studying classical Greek, specifically the dialect of Athens, but we'll talk about that. So generally, when someone says ancient Greek without any further qualifiers, they mean classical Greek. And that's the Greek we'll be talking about today. So Greek as spoken in classical Greece from about 500 BCE to 300 BCE. And I spoke earlier about dialects of Greek. Greek is unlike languages like Latin, for instance. Latin was the language of a single empire, the Roman Empire. Um, and so it was very standardized throughout, Latin writers, for instance. A Latin writer from Spain wrote about the same as a Latin writer from Italy, wrote about the same as a Latin writer from Northern Africa. Um, with Greek, the situation was very different. There was a lot of dialectal difference within ancient Greek, and you can owe that in part. Ooh, I'll admit Kilbert right here from the waiting room. Or actually, Adam, could you admit Kilbert from the waiting room, please? Thank you.
Yeah, I got that stuff about it.
Um, so yes, you can attribute the dialectal variation of Greek in part due to the political variation and fragmentation within Greece. Because Greek society in the classical period was divided in what we call city-states. So these cities like Athens or Sparta or Thebes, for instance, that formed their own, independent body politic. Um, and so you didn't interact politically with neighboring cities. So your speech starts to diverge a little bit, slower and slower, slowly, more and more over time. Greece is a very mountainous country as well, so there's physical barriers as well. Several hundred years pass, and you get to the classical period, and now everyone speaks pretty differently from each other. This is one schema of divvying up the dialects into different groups. There's a Western group, a Central group, and an Eastern group. But again, it also varied from city to city as well. Um, Most of our Greek literature from the classical period comes from the city of Athens. That's where you have, Plato, Demosthenes, Xenophon, etc., etc. Um, and so when you study classical Greek, the dialect that you begin studying and that you study for most of the time is Attic Greek. So again, if you were to take ancient Greek 1 here at Harvard, you would start off by taking classical Attic Greek. And so that will also form the foundation for the Greek we'll be talking about in this talk today. And you can see Athens is part of the Eastern group right there in the purple, closely related to another dialect we call Ionic Greek. But yes, and we call variation that exists within a language at a given point in time, we call that synchronic variation, as contrasting with diachronic variation, which is variation of a language throughout time. So we've covered what ancient Greek is, at least as we'll be talking about it. And let's talk briefly about how it was written. Well, you can see first off this nifty little chart of the Greek alphabet to familiarize yourself with right there on the right. And if you think that it looks pretty similar to the Latin alphabet, you would be correct. And you would be correct because the Latin alphabet actually descends from a Western variety of the ancient Greek alphabet. And our modern Greek alphabet descends from, excuse me, descends from an Eastern variety of the ancient Greek alphabet. So there are some distinctions. I've sort of mapped out the direct letter correspondences to you here. And you can see, most of them, the capital letters especially, look very similar because lowercase letters weren't developed until the Middle Ages. There are some noteworthy exceptions to a general sound correspondence, though. Something that's interesting on the left column near the bottom, you can see those two H-looking letters in Greek corresponding to the English H's. In the ancient Greek alphabet, as we'll be studying it here, that was actually a vowel sound. That was an eh. But in Western Greek dialects, that was actually pronounced as an H, and so that's how it came down to us in Latin. Similarly, you can see right there on the rightmost column, this X-looking letter called a chi, corresponding to an English X. Those are, again, related to each other, but it just so happened that in the Western varieties of Greek, that was pronounced as a x, as opposed to a ka, like it was in the Eastern varieties. And so in modern Greek, it comes down to us as a cha, related to a ka, and in, and in Western varieties, the Latin-derived varieties, it descended from a ksa. So a brief overview of how it was written, and now let's move on to how ancient Greek sounded. Now, it's a very interesting topic in its own right of how we know ancient Greek was sounded. There are a variety of sources. We can look at things like misspellings in manuscripts. We can look at things like graffiti, borrowings into other languages. We can look at the phonology of the modern language. So even though ancient Greek in this form hasn't been spoken for a very long time, we have a pretty good idea of how it was pronounced, and we'll be going over that in one moment. Let me just get a sip of water real quick. So right here, as you see on this table, is a chart of what we call the consonant phones of ancient Greek. If you're familiar with the IPA, this is just the IPA written out. If you're not familiar, we call a phone or a phoneme each like distinct unit of sound in a language. And ancient Greek consonants aren't super like foreign to English speakers. This topmost row right here with what we call the aspirated consonants are probably the most foreign feature, but we'll get into that in a moment. Let's talk about the other consonants first. Pretty basic inventory. You have a p, t, k, p sound, t sound, k sound, ba, da, ga. You have an an you have an in certain places. The ancient Greek S is interesting. Similar to an S sound as you have in modern English, except it is what we call more retracted. So your tongue, the blade of your tongue is further back in your mouth as you're pronouncing it. So instead of sounding like a sa, it's like a sa. It's actually halfway between a sa and a sha, like two sounds that we have in English. And actually a funny story, this variety of S still exists in modern Greek today. And my grandmother grew up with a lot of Greek speakers, modern Greek speakers, and she would always make fun of their accent by saying that they couldn't pronounce sa, they could only say sha. So they would say like, why can I not think of a word with S? But basically they would pronounce words with S as though they started with sha in her perception of it, which is, not completely far off, but it's a little more nuanced than that. It's a similar situation for the Z sound, which occurs in certain contexts. So instead of a Z, it's more like a Z. There was an R sound in ancient Greek, a rolled R, like in Spanish, ra. There was also a voiceless R, which is very interesting. A voiceless R it's like a rolled R, but it's sort of like pronouncing an H at the same time. So you're expelling air while you say it. So it's like ha, ha. And that's how the R sound actually sounded in the beginning of all ancient Greek words, which is a little bit of an interesting tidbit. And there was also an L sound, so there was a distinction between those liquids as well. So let's talk about the one super foreign feature here, which is the aspirated consonants. So in English, how aspirated a consonant is, it doesn't determine meaning. And what we mean by aspiration is, again, how much air you're letting out when you're saying the consonant. So for instance, when you say pit, the P in pit is very aspirated. There's a lot of air coming out. But the P you say in spit is very unaspirated. There's not a lot of air coming out at all when you say that. But that doesn't determine anything in English. It's just a matter of what environment the sound occurs in. In ancient Greek, these were distinct sounds, an aspirated P from the unaspirated P. So pa is as distinct from pa as pa is from ba. Same distinction for ta and ta, as well as ka and ka. And in addition, the ancient Greek T and D was a little more dental than it is in English. So it's closer to how you pronounce it in Spanish and French than it is in English. So it's more so like a ta than it is like a ta. But yeah, those are the unique features of ancient Greek consonants. Ancient Greek vowels are pretty simple. The most noteworthy feature here is the long and short distinction, not like it exists in English, where an I is just completely different from I, almost no relation. But the difference here, the active difference really being how long you pronounce the vowel. So like E versus E, and A versus ah, for instance. So in the short vowels, it's a pretty basic 5-vowel system. So a, e, I, o, and u, pretty close to Spanish. The difference here being that the u, what would be an u sound, is more fronted in this variety of Greek at this time, so that it's closer to a French u, as in tu. The long vowels, there are more distinctions among the long vowels. There are 2 different kinds of e's in the long vowels. There's an a as in like a British person saying hair, for instance, where we would say hair. And there's an a. Think of like a Scottish person saying like bait, for instance. So two different kinds of e. There's one kind of o, a long backed rounded o. There used to be a second kind of o, but that long o, excuse me, got raised in your mouth to an oo. So you have in the back of your mouth, you have an o and an oo here. Yeah. So again, long and short distinction being the active difference here. And the most interesting feature of ancient Greek pronunciation and phonology is probably the pitch accent, as we call it. Now, if you've studied Chinese or Japanese, you'd probably be very familiar with this. The ancient Greek pitch accent is similar to that in Chinese, which, for instance, in Chinese, basically each syllable has its own tone or like musical pitch. The ancient Greek pitch system is more similar to Japanese in that it's just one distinctive pitch per word, basically. And there's three different kinds of pitch accents in ancient Greek. There is what we call the acute accent, which carries a high or rising tone. And I should say this all contrasts to a stress accent, as we say in English. So for instance, in English, you say like abort, you just say the bort in abort louder and a bit more forcefully and a little bit longer. In ancient Greek, it's not necessarily what you do. It's a matter of the difference in pitch. And one option for the pitch you can have is the acute accent, which occurs. Oh, I also just realized I can't see the participant board currently, so I can't see who's raising their hands. So if you have a question, please just unmute yourself and interrupt me. Sorry about that. So one of the options for the ancient Greek accent is the acute accent, which is a high or rising pitch. So for instance, in the ancient Greek word autos, the tos is higher in pitch than the au. And in the word krene, the tone there is rising because it's a long vowel. The grav, as that's pronounced in ancient Greek parlance, the grav accent is like a low or level accent. We're not entirely sure how it was. It was probably just a level accent though. So like autos, the pitch remains the same in the word. And this is just sort of a variety of the acute accent as it occurs directly before certain words. And we also have the circumflex accent, as we call it, which starts with, the pitch on a circumflex accent starts high and then lowers. So you have, for instance, auton. So auton in ancient Greek. And that can only occur on long vowels because it needs a certain amount of time for the pitch to start high and then lower itself. So yes, these are very hard distinctions for a native English speaker, where this isn't a phonemic distinction at all. And so yeah, and then my arrows there on the right, sort of being a bit showing exactly how that works. But yes, so we've covered ancient Greek phonology, basically. So I figured in order to demonstrate it for you a little bit, I would read two sample passages for you. This first one is poetry. This is the first 7 lines of Homer's Iliad, with translation written out on the right if you're interested. Not mine, by A.S. Klein. And yes, poetry is very useful because it sort of accentuates the distinctive features of ancient Greek, as we will see. So, and this is how an Athenian around the year 400, let's say, would have pronounced it. So, and these are again the first 7 lines of the Iliad. So we have Meninae de thea Peleiadeo Achilleos ulomene me myria kaios alge et heke polas diptibus psychas aibi proiapsin heron autuste loria teuke kinesin oio noisite pasi dios te excuse me pasi dios te teleie tobule ex hude ta prota diaste tenerisante atreides te anaxandron kai dios Achilleus. So yes, you can sort of hear the pitch distinctions in there. You can hear the active nature of the vowel length being very prominent, especially in poetry. And it's just a fun passage to read as well. This is a prose passage right here. This is the first sentence of Plato's Apology of Socrates. And an Athenian probably would have said this something like, Otimen hyme so andres athenaioi, bepon tate hypotonemon kategoron, uk oida. Ego dun kaio tos hypautono ligu emautu epelatomen, hu to pitanos elegon. Kai toi ale teskehos epos e pen, uden ele kasin. So something you might be picking up on is that ancient Greek kind of sounds like Japanese, and that's not just a matter of chance. Japanese also has a pitch accent system. Japanese and ancient Greek are both what we call moritimed languages, which are languages, basically for which the amount of time it takes you to say something depends a lot on the length of vowels and syllables. And the general, vowel and consonant systems between the two aren't too far removed. So that's a fun fact you can bring up at the dinner table sometime. Ancient Greek kind of sounded like Japanese. So yes, we've talked about how ancient Greek sounded, and now we can move on to the meat of the language, how the nouns and the verbs work. It's what it's all comes back to. And I'm gonna get a quick sip of water. Okay. So let's talk about ancient Greek nouns. So the first thing to discuss let me rephrase that. The first thing to discuss when talking about ancient Greek nouns is what we call the nominal morphology. So morphology means the different shapes that words can take. So like take in English versus takes versus taken versus took, those are all different morphological distinctions. And by nominal, we mean as referring to nouns and adjectives. And so there are three genders for nouns and adjectives in ancient Greek, similar to like Spanish or Italian. For instance, there's a masculine and feminine, but there's also a neuter. These don't correspond directly to natural gender in any way. They're sort of just arbitrary classes into which you can put nouns, and then they decline, and then they change forms in certain ways. The most important part about ancient Greek nouns and adjectives is what we call their nominal cases. Nominal cases are endings on a word that show the noun or adjective's role in the sentence. And this contrasts with like restrictive word order as we find it in English. English actually does have a couple of words with nominal cases. For instance, the word he. So he, as in he pets the dog, is distinct from him, as in the dog kisses him. He is the object and him is the subject form of this word he. You would never get confused when saying he pets the dog. You wouldn't think the dog is petting the guy. You're like, okay, I know that the guy is the one who's petting the dog. Similar with situation with him. These are what we call nominative and accusative functions or cases. So nominative as forming the subject, accusative as forming the direct object. There's also dative cases or dative functions of cases. English him also can function in this way. The dog gives him a kiss. And there's also the genitive, which in this case, roughly corresponds to an English possessive. So that is his dog. That's the genitive function, indicating possession. And these functions, as mapped out in English, correspond roughly to the nominal cases of ancient Greek. So you could say he can be roughly translated as ekenos, him as the direct object, as ekenon, him as the indirect object, as ekenoi, and then his as a possessor, as ekenu. And this is one word in ancient Greek, and one way of declining one word in what we call nominal cases. We call one way of declining a word in a nominal case system a declension. There are three basic declensions in ancient Greek. And every single noun in the language falls pretty much into one of these three declensions. There's no distinction in meaning here. They all mean the same thing. It's just a different way of saying it. So just like moose is still the plural of moose, and there's no difference for the plural of moose as there is for like book, saying books as the plural for book. It's just different ways of conveying the same grammatical notion. Um, and yeah, these are some instances of these declensions here. It's a bit of a handful to memorize if you're ever deciding to learn ancient Greek, for instance. That's a recurring theme. There's a lot to memorize, but we'll get into that more. Something else that you might find interesting is the definite article, which does exist in ancient Greek. There is no indefinite article, but there's a definite article. And the definite article is basically the word the. And the definite article in ancient Greek functions like an adjective, basically, and that it has to agree with the thing that it is describing. And so it, excuse me. And so it declines for, well, let's just go through it. It has to agree with its noun or adjective, whether it is masculine or feminine or neuter. It has to agree with it in any of the 4 cases it appears in. And then it also has to agree with it, whether it's in the singular or plural. So 3 times 4 times 2, you end up with 24 different words for the in ancient Greek. If you've taken German, it's the exact same thing. So again, a lot to memorize in ancient Greek, especially contrasted with the one word for the in English. Another interesting function of the nominal cases in ancient Greek is that they can also express location in certain contexts, generally with prepositions. So when a preposition takes a noun or an adjective as its object, generally it prefers the noun or adjective being a certain case, but sometimes it doesn't really matter. Or let me say, it can be any one of the cases, and whichever case you choose ends up determining what shade of meaning that preposition is being used with. So when you use the accusative, that generally expresses motion towards something. The genitive generally expresses motion away from something, and the dative generally expresses something being at or on something else. I actually ripped this picture right here on the right from my old ancient Greek textbook. So this is exactly how I learned it as being. And a really good instance of seeing this play out is with the preposition para. Para generally means the side of something. And whichever of these cases you use it with, it means something slightly different. So if you use it with the dative case, if you are para gepyrai, gepyrai meaning a bridge, you are beside the bridge, I being the dative case ending. If you get a letter that is para autu, you get a letter that is from somebody in the genitive case. And this is a very interesting extension of the meaning of para. So when something is para doksan, it is contrary to belief. And we say that because if you think about it, motion towards next to something, it's reminiscent of parallel lines. And the thing about parallel lines is that they never intersect. So if you are never intersecting with something, you are contrary to that position. So therefore, something is paradoxan is like parallel to, never intersects with what you think would happen in popular belief. And this is actually where we get the modern word paradox, something that is contrary to what you think it would be. And yeah, this is another usage of the nominal cases that definitely does not exist in English, but you can sort of see how it could exist hypothetically, and as it does in ancient Greek. Another really interesting thing that nouns and adjectives can do in ancient Greek is be in what we call the dual number. Now, in English, we only have the singular and the plural. If I have book, book is specifically one thing, and books is any number of more than one thing. You can't get any more specific than that without using more words. In ancient Greek, however, you do have the option to be more specific just by making changes to the word itself. And you can see this in this passage from the Iliad right here. Lis setopantas akaius atreida bemalista duokos me torelaon. So this is talking about Chryse begging the two sons of Atreus, Agamemnon and Menelaus, those two commanders of soldiers. And while there is an explicit word for two here as well, duo, the form of these words, son of Atreus and commanders of soldiers, the specific forms of those words are in the dual. So you could use those on their own as well to mean two of something. And this is commonly done in the Iliad and the Odyssey when referring to like Agamemnon and Menelaus, for instance, to a note, something that is noteworthy for coming in a pair. Sometimes in classical Greek, you can see this for like your arms taken in the dual, your ears, your legs, your hands, your feet, something like that. But even by the classical period, the dual was already becoming more and more rare. You see it a lot relatively in the Iliad and the Odyssey, but not a lot in, say, the writings of Plato. And so it makes sense, very specialized usage like that would probably be bound to just fall out, over time, which it did. Doesn't exist in modern Greek, definitely. But again, something, if you hadn't ever considered it, more examples of ways of doing singular and plural than just singular and plural. So we've covered, there's some messages going on. Oh, excuse me. So we have covered how ancient Greek nouns work, basically. We covered some of the most interesting parts of ancient Greek nouns. And now we can spend a bit of time talking about how ancient Greek verbs work. Now, I just say out here pretty outright, ancient Greek verbal morphology, so how verbs change and take different forms, is kind of insane and pretty hard to learn. And I say that from firsthand experience. So in English, you have like 5, maybe 6 different ways a verb can like change its form. Like I learn, he learns, I am learning, I learned, and I have learned. In ancient Greek, you have lots more options. Let me take a quick sip of water. All right. So these are all the options for a verb in the present tense that you can have in ancient Greek. Each of these blue Greek words you see right here is a distinct Greek word. So like paideuo is like specifically the word paideuo means like to educate someone, basically. So paideuo means I am educating. Paideues means you are educating, and so on and so forth. Similar to like, again, Spanish, Italian, French, any one of those modern Romance languages, Latin, for instance. So there are a lot of different forms here. You most probably not familiar with all these grammatical terms that are sort of on the left-hand side and at the top and everything, but we'll be going into that in a moment. Oh yeah, so this is the present tense right here in ancient Greek. You also have all these forms completely distinct from one another, mind you, in the imperfect tense and the future tense and the aorist tense, which is like the past tense, and then the perfect tense, and then the pluperfect tense. So yes, it's a lot to take in. So to make this more digestible, there's 3 things we can talk about and sort of start to unpack this grid-like structure of the ancient Greek verb system. There's tense and aspect, there is mood, and there is voice. Again, if you're not familiar with these terms, don't worry, because we're going to be talking about them right now. So tense and aspect. The ancient Greek verbal system is basically fundamentally organized around these distinctions. And it's important to delineate which is which. Tense, very simply, when an action takes place, past, present, future, just like you have it in English, just like you have in most other languages, nothing super out of the ordinary there. The interesting part of ancient Greek is that it also explicitly denotes aspect. Aspect is how the occurrence of an action is viewed. And that is that's a pretty opaque definition, I know, but maybe some examples of it will make it a little more clear. So there are 3 kinds of aspect in ancient Greek, at least. There is simple aspect. That is just the verb as a simple one and done occurring once event. I walked to the store yesterday in English. That's it. You did it once and then you were done. there's progressive or repeated aspect for an action that is in progress or repeated. So let's say when you were walking to the store yesterday, the sun was shining. The sun was in the process of shining. The sun continued to shine for that entire duration. The sun didn't begin and stop shining just, at one point in time. It was a repeated, continued process. There's also completed aspect. This is a bit counterintuitive. It sort of seems like it should be a past tense, but it's not. It's for an action that is already completed or an action that is in the state of having been completed. So when you got to the store yesterday, the store had closed already. When you arrived, the store was in the state of having been closed, basically. So these three aspectual distinctions, as we say, sort of form a grid-like system intersecting with the tense distinctions at certain points in order to give us the tenses of ancient Greek, which are really tense aspect pairs, as we will see right now. So this is, again, I ripped this right from my old textbook. So you have the three kinds of aspect at the top right there, and you have the three kinds of tense right there on the left. So let's just look at this. It's pretty simple in practice. When you want to use the simple aspect in referring to the past, you use the aorist tense. When you want to use the progressive or repeated aspect in the past, you use the imperfect tense. And when you want to use the completed aspect in the past, you use the pluperfect tense. You can see English translations or English examples of these tense aspect pairs right here to make it a little more intuitive. And again, so this grid right here is how the entire ancient Greek system is organized. A noteworthy sort of elision, I guess you could say, is the lack of a simple aspect in the present time. That's just by virtue of the present being like a continuous state by its very nature, not like a single moment in time. And there's no time you really use that when you're speaking a language anyway. I'm not familiar with any languages that have a simple aspect for the present time, but I would love to hear of any if you guys have any. So yes, so knowing these distinctions now and sort of having them in mind, it makes this crazy looking verb chart a little more digestible. So I don't want to focus on the forms of the verbs right now. I just want to focus on the present tense. So you have all these forms in the present tense for something that is progressive or repeated aspect in the present, imperfect, progressive or repeated aspect in the past, future, progressive or repeated aspect in the future, the aorist for simple aspect in the past, the perfect for completed aspect in the present. Completed aspect is also called perfective in some grammatical contexts. So this is why it's called the perfect tense here. And then the pluperfect, also like literally plus perfect, more than perfect, because it takes place in the past. That's the completed aspect as taking place in the past. We talked about the three important distinctions to help make the ancient Greek verb system a bit more digestible. The other distinction that is important to note is what's called mood. The mood of a verb indicates what kind of statement you're making, the type of statement you're making. So we have this picture right here, indicating very clearly that the sky is in fact blue. Now, if you wanted to just state that fact, the verb that you use would be in what we call the indicative mood. So the sky is blue. There's no room for debate there. If you want to indicate a hypothetical situation in a lot of languages, and it used to be this way in English as well, you would use what's called the subjunctive mood. So if you want to talk about hypothetically if the sky weren't blue, in ancient Greek, that would be a distinct form of the verb in what we call the subjunctive mood. There's also, you might be familiar with the subjunctive mood in German, again, French, Spanish, Italian, any number of languages. The subjunctive is very common for indicating like unreal conditions in other languages. Ancient Greek also has, another option for expressing unreal conditions with a specific tilt to them, sort of. This is called the optative mood. The optative mood is used for wishful wishes, basically, things you wish were the case. So if you were like, if only the sky were green, my life would be so much better if the sky were green, and so on and so forth. In ancient Greek, if you wanted to say that, you would use what's called the optative mood, because it's another unreal condition, but specifically it's something you want to be the case, or you wish were the case. And then there's also the imperative, which also exists in English. Be happy that the sky is blue. You're telling someone to do something, and that's just no indication that it's like impossible to do or something like that. It's pretty simple. So again, the subjunctive and the optative, two things that exist in ancient Greek that really don't exist in English. So again, looking at our nifty little verb chart here, we can see right there. So again, this is the present tense. So continuous or repeated aspect in the present time. If you want to say that something plain is happening in the present time, you have right here at the top left of this chart, paidewo. So, I am for a fact educating someone right now. If you wish you were educating someone, you would say paidewoimi. If only I were educating someone, or I wish I were educating someone. And then you can do this in different tense aspect pairs as well. Use indicative or optative or subjunctive. The aorist forms a good instance of this. Something that is very interesting to note is that in the subjunctive and optative, the tense part of the tense aspect pairs stops being relevant, and it's only a matter of aspect that starts being relevant. So, and this is very interesting, actually. So if you were to use the optative in the present tense, that would be indicating, because the present tense in the subjunctive and optative is used for the continuous and progressive aspect. So that would be like saying, I want to be in the process of educating someone right now. Whereas if you use the optative in the aorist, which is used for the simple aspect, that would be indicating, so like paideosaimi in the optative, that indicates, I wish I could educate someone once, at one time. Very interesting distinction how, so like the present tense in certain contexts doesn't even indicate the present at all. And the aorist, which is used in the indicative as a past tense, stops explicitly being a past tense thing in, these irrealis moods of sorts. And then another important thing to talk about with the verbs is what we call the voice of the verb. And you can see this in English as well with the active and passive voice. I wash my car, the subject is performing the verb onto something else. I being the subject, car being the object, wash being the verb. The passive voice, again, used for subjects that are having verbs performed onto it, sometimes by what we call an agent, being like the one who's doing the object, the one who's doing the action of this verb, I should say. So my car is being washed by me. So car is the subject, but it's having the action of the verb performed onto it. And me here is functioning as the agent of that passive construction. Ancient Greek also has what we call a middle voice that, again, does not exist in English. So for instance, the middle voice in ancient Greek, you use for instance, reflexive things. If you want to say you're performing the action of a verb onto or upon yourself, you use the middle voice in ancient Greek. So I wash myself, that would be, so that wash myself right there would be a single verb in ancient Greek. You can also do this a bit more liberally in ancient Greek than specific like reflexive verbs. You can also use this to indicate that you're doing something for yourself. So for instance, if you were going to pay a ransom for somebody to be released in like the Iliad or something, and this person were like your daughter, in the case of Chryse, you would use the middle voice here because you are ransoming your daughter for your own benefit. Even though you're not like ransoming yourself or anything, it's not a reflexive usage there. It's a more so like directed towards yourself usage. It's not very intuitive for English speakers, and it can be a little even more confusing in ancient Greek because the middle and the passive voice, as you can see on the left, are confounded in certain tense aspect pairs. So for instance, in the present tense system, the middle and the passive voice are homophonous, we should say, because they do convey distinct meanings when used in distinct contexts. They just have the exact same like written and spoken forms, basically. If you look at something like, let's go to the aorist tense, you see that this is not the case. So for instance, the active voice in the aorist, epaideosa, completely distinct from the middle voice, epaideosamen. And that is completely distinct from the passive voice, epaidoten. And so, yes, ancient Greek verbal system can be confusing by its very nature, can sort of also be confusing by things like this that happen, where things aren't exactly as clear as they could be in certain tenses. And, again, speaking as someone who's had to internalize all of this, if you ever take ancient Greek, you're in for a wild ride, that's for sure. Pretty fun, though. So this is to telos, this is the end. And for listening to my talk, I say O Karisto, which is I thank you, basically. And fun fact, this word still exists in modern Greek, except that by some, fun sound changes over time, instead of being pronounced Eucharisto, it's now pronounced Evcharisto. So yeah, thank you guys for listening.
Thank you. If anybody has questions, put them in the participants thing. I want to ask a question.
Yeah.
What are some notable differences between the classical Attic Greek dialect and other dialects? Is there anything interesting, like phonologically, between the dialects?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So you guys can still see my screen, right?
Yeah.
Okay, let me go back into presenter view. Let me get a quick sip of water, one sec. Yes. So that was specifically about like different like periods of time in ancient Greek, right? Yeah. So classical Greek was a very noteworthy period in the history of the language. And so for a lot of writers afterward, it was sort of a standard to be like aspired for when you were writing ancient Greek. So like a lot of higher register Greek, even after the classical period, still tends to be what we say Atticizing, sort of like imitative of Attic Greek. You can even see this in like older high registers of modern Greek too. So we have what's called Katharevusa, which is like a 19th century version of modern Greek, which was basically attempting to be Attic Greek again in the written form. That's the exception as opposed to the rule, though. So, like, for instance, Koine Greek, it was the lingua franca of the Mediterranean region, um, basically entirely owed to the conquest of Alexander the Great. So after Alexander the Great, Macedonian, conquered Greece, adopted Attic Greek as the official language of his empire, and then spread it, all the way to India. Actually, we actually have surviving ancient Greek from the Indic region. As that period progressed, Koine Greek is basically Attic Greek, but also a couple noteworthy features of other dialects that just happen to get subsumed into this standard. So like a very noteworthy instance in Attic Greek, the word for sea, like the sea, is talata, with the second set of consonants there being t. In other dialects of Greek, basically every other dialect Greek, it was talasa, with two s's. And the S form, the talasa, is actually what got carried forward into Koine Greek, as opposed to the particularly Attic form. And so that's one instance. Koine Greek is, again, it's a very lingua franca-y language. It's a lot simpler than Attic Greek, a lot less irregularity in the language because it was used by so many people. And then Koine Greek is the single ancestor of Byzantine Greek and modern Greek, actually. So that's just a pretty standard development of the language from there. And Homeric Greek is very interesting because, as I mentioned before, it's actually a blending of two dialects in particular that aren't even Attic, actually. So if you look here, you can see in yellow the Aeolic dialect, and in the like bluish purple, the Ionic dialect. these are the two primary dialects that constitute Homeric Greek, the Greek of the Iliad and the Odyssey. So if you study like a classical Greek class here at Harvard, you're not even necessarily learning how to read the Odyssey. And it's earlier as well. It integrates some archaic forms like the dual, as we discussed. And then Mycenaean Greek is a whole nother beast because it's so much earlier than classical Greek. But yeah, there are some going from classical Greek forward, though, it's a lot less crazy in terms of like variation and things like that. So are there questions in the chat that I can look at, or
What are some of your favorite Greek etymologies?
I talked about paradoxan. That's very interesting. Um, any other interesting? Well, actually, the words for right here, as I used in my talk, diachronic and synchronic. So dia is our modern pronunciation of the ancient Greek dia, which means like through, and then chronic from like, you know, Chronos, the god of time. So this is literally variation through time. And then the sing in synchronic variation comes from the ancient Greek syn, and that means like together, basically, sort of like conveying a notion of like togetherness. So it's like together time variation at the same time, basically. Um, so much stuff comes, so much like grammatical, like academic stuff comes from ancient Greek. So it's interesting to be able to just spot those sometimes.
Anybody else have questions? All right. Well, thank you so much for doing this, Blake. That was a really interesting presentation and very well done.
Thank you. All right, I'm glad we could have fun with this tonight. This was super fun. Do you want me to end the recording now?
I think that's Ben's end.
Oh, okay, got it.